Well, hi to everyone watching this, and welcome to a new episode of Pause to Pray. You've got me for the next two sessions. I'd like to share with you one of my favourite theories, which is called nominative determinism. So, if you haven't heard of this, the idea behind nominative determinism is that your name somehow determines your path in life. So, generally, where you end up working. It can determine other things in your life. And I think it was originally the New Scientist magazine that first started researching this idea. And there's been quite a lot of some semi-serious research done and other less serious research done. So just to give you some examples of people with amusing names that seem very appropriate to their jobs. There's a lawyer in America called Sue Yu, a Dutch architect called Rem Koolhaas, aviation planner called Rod Muddle. Slightly more sinister, the US Navy spokesman for Guantanamo Bay was called Mike Kafka. And it goes on and on. There are hundreds of these examples that people have found and sent in where a person's name seems absolutely appropriate for the job that they work in. And the theory behind nominative determinism is that the name that you're given at birth determines where you end up in life and what you end up doing. It's not just done for individual names as well. So, for example, there's been a study done that shows that in America, people named Dennis are much more likely to become dentists than you would expect if they were just randomly to go into career choices. So being called Dennis somehow makes them more likely to become dentists. And this is a particularly favourite theory of mine. So I've got many of these things rattling around in my mind. And I'm generally delighted when in my own line of work I come across what I see as examples of nominative determinism. So I was particularly happy last year when I was having to do a work project at Sizewell B power plant, replacing some pipe work, and the project engineer in charge of it was called Dave Pipes, and I was doubly excited when one of his colleagues called Mr. Welding who was a welding engineer, joined us for one of the meetings where we were talking about how we'd go about this replacement project. So although it generally gives me a lot of fairly harmless amusement, there have been some slightly worrying times as well. I remember my first job, I needed to get a really full medical. So I must have been about 21 or 22. I got the big pack of paperwork through the post from Bupa, and it told me that my doctor for my examination in 3 days' time was Dr. G. Roper. So it didn't seem quite so funny that time round. Of course, it's not always true. My fellow church member, Mike Godfrey, you'd think that Godfrey would be a name that would set you up to be a lifelong atheist, but it's great to see that he's joined Hillview Church, and he's also done some of these talks prior to mine. So not always true by any means. So why am I talking about this? Well, Jesus is given in the Bible. He's given hundreds, I think over a couple of hundred names and titles. A lot of them are so familiar to us that we don't really think about it. Things like King of Kings, Lord of Lords, Son of Man, Good Shepherd, Lamb. But there's one that always strikes me around Christmas time, and it's Emmanuel, God is with us. And this comes from a verse in Matthew. So I'm just going to read Matthew chapter 1, verse 23, which says, "Look, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall name him Emmanuel," which means God with us. And this wasn't a promise that was only valid during the life of Jesus, because we can then look right at the end of chapter 28, verse 20, where in Jesus' last words in the book of Matthew, he says, "And remember, I am with you always to the end of the age." Maybe for our first pause to pray, we could just think for a few minutes and pray for a few moments about that amazing promise in these quite scary, frankly, times. That promise from God, that God is with us, and he is with us until the end of the age. Well, welcome back to the second half of this talk. So, are you now a believer in nominative determinism? Have I converted you? Well, if you are, it's a relatively harmless amusement. But in the second half, I want to think a bit more about names. So as I've read through the Old Testament, it seems to me that names are important. People's names are important. You start right from the beginning with Adam, meaning earth or ground, really emphasising the mortality of humans. You could go through a whole list of Old Testament characters. You've got people like Esau, meaning hairy, not a very popular name these days. His twin brother Jacob, a lot more popular, meaning heel grabber. I want to look at Luke chapter 1, verse 57. This is all about naming, and this is in just before the birth of Jesus. So actually I'll read from verse 59, where it says, "On the 8th day they came to circumcise the child, and they were going to name him Zachariah after his father. But his mother said, 'No, he is to be called John.' They said to her, 'None of your relatives has this name.' Then they began motioning to his father to find out what name he wanted to give him. He asked for a writing tablet and wrote, 'His name is John.' Immediately his mouth was opened and his tongue freed, and he began to speak, praising God. Fear came over all their neighbours, and all these things were talked about throughout the entire hill country of Judea. All who heard them pondered them and said, 'What then will this child become?' For indeed the hand of the Lord was with him." So I think names in the Bible are important, really are. And in this case, it was the angel that said that this particular boy should be called John, perhaps emphasising, rather than calling him Zachariah like his father, like the tradition, that John was going to take a totally different path in life to his father, rather than following in the sort of the family tradition of being a priest. So our name's important for us today. So going forward 1600 years or so to Shakespeare writing in Romeo and Juliet, what's in a name? That which we call a rose by any name would smell as sweet. Emphasising here that the important thing is the person, not the name. So do our names reveal much about us today? Well, I would probably, before I had children, I might well have said maybe not. But when I came with my wife to naming our own children, I found it was actually quite difficult. It was an awesome responsibility trying to choose a name that would, I guess in some ways, fit their personality, fit their way in life. And it's interesting as well, as a Sunday school teacher, it's really interesting to see that loads of the kids still, parents are choosing names from the Bible. So quite often people that have lived inspirational lives that played key roles in the history and the story of the Bible. So I think that names still are important. And it made me think, I guess, about my own name, Timothy. meaning God-fearing. And perhaps as we close, maybe just take a moment to think about your own name. It was given to you by your parents that obviously cared a lot about you and loved you, and they chose it for a reason. And if you don't know what your name means, maybe find out about it, find out what it means, and perhaps use that as a bit of an inspiration. So just as we finish up, I'm certainly been thinking a bit more about my name, God-fearing. Am I really living that life out? And I've also got the advantage that as I've got a biblical name, I've got books of the Bible named after me. So it's one of my Christian New Year's resolutions, as it were, to read those books more carefully and perhaps see if I can see something of the life of Timothy that could be an inspiration for me in this year going forward.